Greetings, growers from around the world. Jordan River here, back with more Growcast coming at ya. Carbon-based, baby. Today we have Nick from Rooted Leaf back on the line. He is a wonderful educator. He is here to talk to us today about senescence and flavonoids and all that fun stuff that goes along with late flower. I know you're going to love today's episode with Nick, but before we jump into it, shout out to Dino Myco, everybody. You know Dino Myco. You love Dino Myco. DYNOMYCO.com. Code GROWCAST for 10% off, and members of the Order of Cultivation getting 20% off their Dino Myco mycorrhizal fungi. Ari from Dino Myco has come on the show before, and he's talked about what makes his product so special. This is a unique strain of mycorrhizal fungi harvested in nature, in Israel, a very hardy strain that you really can't find anywhere else. If you haven't used a myco product yet, toss this in your medium, see the amazing results, faster growth rates, bigger yields, healthier plants. You won't believe it. And if you're unhappy with your myco product, try Dino Myco today. Just do a little side-by-side. Use code GROWCAST to get 10% off. And of course, members of the Order of Cultivation getting 20% off. Find our membership at growcastpodcast.com/membership. And find Dino Myco at dinomyco.com. Use code GROWCAST always. Thank you to Dino Myco. All right, everyone, let's get into it with Nick from Rooted Leaf. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show. Hello, podcast listeners. You are now listening to Growcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in again today. Before we get started, as always, I urge you to share this show. Turn someone on to Growcast Podcast, tell a smoker, tell a grower, get someone growing. It's the best thing you can do. And see everything that we're doing in the Growcast universe at growcastpodcast.com/action. Find membership and seeds and the classes and everything up there. Available for you, dear listener. Today we have back on the line a great friend of the show, a multiple GCTV guest, by the way, from Rooted Leaf. Nick is back on. What's up, man? How's it going?
Hey, Jordan, I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
Doing excellent, man. Doing excellent. Thank you for coming on the show once again. Nick, of course, the founder and owner of Rooted Leaf. Code GROWCAST, saving you 20% over at Rooted Leaf Agritech. You guys know that I'm using a combination liquid organic nutrient regimen right now. Absolutely loving it, man. Loving Rooted Leaf. Loving everything you're doing. Quickly update us, Nick, on what's been going on in your world since we last spoke. And then we'll get into today's subject for Croptober, which is late flower and harvest and all that good stuff. But what have you been up to?
Oh, man, we've been staying busy over the past few weeks. I just kind of got back recently from a whole whirlwind of tours across the U.S. First, I went to New York for just about a week. And then from New York, I flew to Colorado to do the CanaCon that was there. And then after that, I kind of got back here and hit the ground running. And less than a month later, I've booked up some booth space and some tickets to fly out to Oklahoma yet again. So it's going to be really, really fun at the end of this month. We're going to be down there for about 6 days from October 29th through November 4th. And we're just going to go and have a great time with a bunch of existing friends and current customers. And then we're also going to make some new friends and some new customers. So I'm definitely looking forward to that. But yeah, we've been super busy. It's a lot of good time right now to be alive in the fertilizer industry. There's a lot of turnover, generally speaking, but there's a lot of really, really good opportunities because the market is shifting towards a place where people ultimately need to find better ways of doing things. And yeah, so it's fun.
I love it, man. And by the way, you can come and hang out with Nick and everybody here in the Oklahoma crew. October 30th, we have the Cannabis Picnic, and that's at Cannabis 29th Street. It's a free meetup, free burgers and free dogs while supplies last. I'm not sure supplies are going to last long because I think this is going to be a big one, guys. Brandon Rust is going to be there. Jinx Proof is going to be there. All the Growcast crew is going to be there. Mary Jack is going to be there. Nick is going to be there from Rooted Leaf. Come on down. It's going to be an awesome one. So again, October 30th, the Cannabis Picnic. I'm excited to see you there, man. Very, very cool that you're getting out there. You're meeting growers one-on-one. You know I love that in-person shit, man. That's really where it's at. So glad to see Rooted Leaf is kicking butt in all 50 states.
That's right. That's right. And we're just going to keep expanding. You know, we're looking at Canada right now, and we're looking at other countries for the fertilizer technology we've been developing. So it's great that we had an opportunity to focus on cannabis because what we've learned so much about is kind of relevant to other crops that are grown globally. But as we're about to dive into here, cannabis is a very, very special plant. And there are some considerations, let's say some special things that you should pay attention to, particularly in the flowering stage.
Oh, yeah, man. I'm right there. Just entered week 6 as we're recording this. So, super excited about how my tent is going. And I think it really is my favorite stage of the cannabis growth cycle because you just get to experience the flavors and aromas. There's not a whole lot you got to do at that point when your plants are staked up. You can really just enjoy the swelling and the bulking and the finishing. And that's exactly what we're focusing on today, folks. Focusing on late flower, senescence. It is Croptober after all. So we're going to take a look at this from a kind of nutritional perspective and also dig into Nick's brain when it comes to the entire senescence process. We'll get into dry and cure if we have time as well. So listen, Nick, where do we begin here? You know, the late flower stage, we're talking about after the plants are done bulking, they kind of stop eating as much, you know, and we enter this senescence phase, this natural cycle that my understanding is the plant is eating less nutrition. It's needing less nutrition as it nears the end of its life cycle. So what can you tell us about senescence and what's happening to the plant?
Yeah, senescence is actually a really fascinating topic because it's so complex in terms of what can trigger it, when it's triggered. There's a lot of fundamental processes within the plants that start to change. And those have been kind of changing, particularly for annual plants like cannabis. You know, they go through these drastic morphological differences. And part of it is how that DNA is being expressed and what exactly is going on in the cellular level. So senescence is one of those processes where naturally what happens is some of the existing structures that the plant has built up, let's say during the vegetative stages, like all of that chlorophyll, for example, that beautiful green pigment, that's a source of nitrogen in some cases. So as the plants towards the middle to the end stages of their life, they're kind of weighing the equation of like, okay, well, if I need nitrogen, there's two ways to do it. One is to take it up from the roots and to move it across this whole big surface area of tissue, or the next is I can perhaps find a compound that already has nitrogen inside of it, and I can break that down because it's so close to where I need it to be. It's almost like moving at a minimal distance. So there's a lot of metabolic advantages associated with senescence. And what you typically see during that senescence phase is a lot of the, constituents like chlorophyll, for example, and even to some extent rubisco. Those are very, very abundant enzymes and proteins inside of plants. And they start to get broken down naturally. And some of the nutrition that was present inside of them kind of gets funneled and repurposed for things like the enzymes that are required to make more terpenes and make more cannabinoids. It's a very, very complex process. What exactly happens to trigger senescence? Oftentimes, it can be a multitude of different factors. There are ways to trigger senescence prematurely. If you're doing things like starving the plants of nitrogen, for example, they kind of get it in their head that the biosynthesis of sugars is kind of more or less done and wrapped up at that point. So they tend to
Oh,
finish a little bit earlier and finish a little bit weaker, which is certainly not what you want as a grower. But yeah, the whole point with senescence is to kind of repurpose what's already there, partially due to a metabolic advantage, and then also partially due to the fact that at that point of the plant's life, it's no longer expecting to take in so much light energy or to take up so much water to split apart and continue to make metabolites. It's not really growing anymore. It's not really producing as many compounds. It's just kind of finishing up and wrapping up its end of life cycles, which are baked very deeply into the DNA of these plants.
So that's exactly what I was just going to kind of lead into. It seems to me like, as you're alluding to, there's a variety of things that impact the trigger of senescence. But the largest determining factor, as is everything with the expression of cannabis plants, is the genetics, right? That kind of sets your ballpark, that kind of sets your ceiling of how long this plant's going to flower, how long it's going to eat, how much it's going to eat, and when it's going to stop eating and begin to senesce towards the end. But I'd like to talk about other things that play into that. You said nitrogen, and that makes sense, the difference in nutritional needs from the high nitrogen veg and even into stretch, that bolting phase in between, and then less so late in flower. So nutrition, obviously, can affect senescence. What else? Things like climate, I'd imagine.
Yeah, environmental variables. Particularly, there are certain triggers that regulate how plants metabolize carbon. And one of those triggers is the delta or the difference between daytime and nighttime temperatures. So, typically during the summertime, let's say that delta is much more tight. And certainly in the vegetative stages, if you're in a controlled environment, you want to keep the fluctuations, relatively low if you can. But then when you get into the flowering stage, particularly the mid to end stages, there are some benefits associated with increasing the difference, dropping the temperatures down just a little bit more at nighttime can kind of help promote a certain type of carbon metabolism that produces purple pigments. And these purple pigments, these anthocyanins, have some biological effects. They are kind of very well studied and they're a very, very complex topic in and of itself. It almost requires a separate episode. But, they also contribute something to the overall experience that a grower may be looking for. Sometimes you want some lemon lime sativa dominant, and other times you just need something that's like really dark, deep purple. I've had really, really good strains like a plushberry pheno that just came by recently that it was about as like jet black and purple as it gets, but the terp profile was very interesting because it still had this like very bright citrusy lemon lime pine kind of
Mm.
aromatic going on. It was very, very enjoyable to kind of look at the color and then experience the terp profile being a little bit different than that. So these visual properties and qualities do kind of fall into the overall experience that can be had.
Yeah, no doubt, especially with the heavy anthocyanin production. It's something that I've definitely experienced. I don't know if it's the bitterness of the flavonoids playing into the flavor. This tastes purple. I've certainly had that experience. And then also the similarities in the effects, right? This idea that medicinal antioxidants and flavonoid compounds like anthocyanins don't somehow play into the quote psychoactive experience, even if it's just making you feel a little bit better. I can certainly see that. So I want to get into flavonoid production in just a second, but while we're still on the subject of nutrition here, not all elements are created equal or looked at equally when we're dealing with senescence, right? Things like phosphorus can still be pretty high late in flower. Do I have that right? As opposed to things like nitrogen can really fuck up your crop.
Yeah, nitrogen is one of those things where as an element, it becomes a constituent of organic matter and proteins. And, to some extent, it can be considered a cofactor because of its redox states. So it's very, very useful. But on the flip side, too, nitrogen is ubiquitous as a signaling element and a signaling molecule in plants, which means that if you have too much nitrogen in those mid to late stages of bloom, it acts like a signaling element to tell the plant, like, maybe you want to grow a little bit more leaf tissue.
Right.
You got enough nitrogen, you can make more sugars. And you get this kind of difference overall in the growth. The buds get a lot more stretchy. And instead of flattening out at the top like they should and forming a nice Christmas tree-like shape, they actually continue to push like a push pop. They will continue to stretch out, get a little bit more airy. And in some cases, you actually do end up with these tiny, tiny little leaves. They're almost like duck tongues. They look very, very, they've got this like flat line through the middle, and they're not quite, like a full leaf set necessarily. But the problem with that is because it accumulates a lot of nitrogen and magnesium, these minerals can contribute to sort of an off taste in the flower that, may be a little bit more harsh and burn a little bit different than what a connoisseur might want to see. And so, yeah, there is a difference in terms of not all nutrients are weight equally in those senescent stages, because there are elements that maybe you do want, such as potassium and calcium to some extent, because those, unlike nitrogen, will not contribute to an off taste, particularly potassium, because of the way that it interacts with plants. But most people, like you mentioned, phosphorus, the whole conversation of phosphorus and really PK boosters at large is kind of an interesting one to have, particularly because I feel like phosphorus is over applied in the cannabis industry, and a lot of people don't actually get the types of benefits that they think that they do. The way that phosphorus works in plants is perhaps a little bit different, and there is some level of strategy associated with the PK booster concept, but it's really only relevant if you're growing for seeds. If you're just growing for the flower, there's a definite point at which, both in terms of ppm concentration and timing in the plant's lifespan, there's a definite point at which any additional amount does not actually contribute to the benefit of the plant. It can, in certain cases, create a detriment to the plant because it may tie up with calcium, for example. It'll make calcium phosphate in the soil, which is not very soluble. So if the plants have enough P, but they're looking for more calcium, and you add the PK booster into the soil, you're really just limiting the availability of calcium in the plants. And then they start to get, a little bit yellow before they should. Maybe weeks 3 to 5, you notice the plant slow down. You're like, that's weird. I wonder what's going on there. Could be related to that. Not saying it is 100% of the times, but a lot of times when PK boosters are over applied, there are a multitude of things that start to go wrong with the plants.
Specifically around calcium. No, I think that's an experience that a lot of growers have had. I think that I had confused potassium and phosphorus in that last statement. I was trying to think of which rooted leaf part goes all the way into week 8, but I may have been confusing that in my mind. I do see less and less of those egregious boosters, though, nowadays, Nick. Do you agree? Like back in the day, you would kind of widely refer to them as a 0, 50, 30. meaning that they're 50% phosphorus and 30% potassium, which is just very, very high applications to put into a cannabis plant in the middle of flower, right? And I feel like the newer nutrient lines are maybe moving away from that a little bit, or do you think that there's still over application?
I think that there's still over application. I think a lot of people hold on to old school trains of thought, and it just kind of comes down to how the industry has grown over the past few years. It kind of just was thrust into the spotlight of being recreational, and there was no real bridge between people that used to grow, in the black market or in the traditional market
Yeah, that's true.
and the larger recreational industry. So what ended up happening was a lot of the mistakes that were made by the companies that got in early and people that had no experience or no business with cannabis in the past, they kind of got in and were like, well, we'll figure this out. And they went through these learning curves and these learning mistakes that people made 20 to 30 to 40 years ago in the traditional markets, but there was no bridge, for that knowledge. And so what ended up happening was for the first couple of years, the PK boosters got really, really out of hand. And you started to see certain things. Like if you take that 0, 50, 30 and you just add it in, a little bit, let's say the recommended amount into a clear pitcher of glass, try stirring it up and see how long it takes to dissolve. There's two things that happen. One is either the monoammonium phosphate or the monopotassium phosphate. If it's like a 1261-0 that's cut with the 05234, you may have a pinch of nitrogen in there, but the PK is what they guarantee. They don't really guarantee the 0.1% monoammonium phosphate or whatever they put in there.
Hmm.
But a lot of times these salts take a very long time to dissolve, and you actually have to agitate it, and you have to use warm water because as they dissolve, they actually absorb heat. So the temperature of the water decreases. This is one of those things, if you've got a temperature probe as part of your pH or your EC meter, give that a shot too. For sure, those salts will soak up heat, and the more heat they soak up, the harder it is to dissolve the salts. So back in the medical days, people that use these boosters would add it into their tanks, maybe last or whatever, let it sit for like 2 to 3 minutes, and then they would apply water to the plants, and there would be a thin layer of salt left over on the bottom. So the last couple of plants got that huge PK boost, and there you would always walk into a medical room that was using these PK boosters. There'd be 1 or 2 plants that were always fried, and the growers like, I don't know what's going on. But when you started to scale those mistakes on a large, 30,000 plus square foot level, this stuff started to get caught really quickly, and people were like, oh crap, these salts take a really, really long time to dissolve. So what you're seeing now is more liquid formulations that have pre-dissolved PK inside of them. What we do with our Peak Bloom is I think, a fundamentally different approach, because the PK itself, most of what you put into the soil, even if it's dissolved in solution, most of the phosphorus has a tendency to tie up in the soil and to kind of become unavailable to plants. So even if you do get something that's dissolved, a lot of times the manufacturers still recommend that you over apply because they know that at least half, if not more, is going to get caught up in the soil. So the plants really aren't going to see the benefit. If you look at the overall ppms that are required for cannabis plants in the literature that's been studied so far, anywhere from 30 to 50, all the way up to, let's say, 75 to 100 on the super high end. That's kind of like your range. And that low to high range just revolves around how intense is your grow environment. If you've got higher CO2 concentrations, higher light intensity, better environmental controls, yeah, the plants will need more phosphorus. Otherwise, it will be a limiting factor. But more out, in terms of nature, just kind of out there, if you're growing sun grown and you're just depending on the natural intensity of the sun and the concentrations of CO2 in the air, you may find that 30 ppms of elemental phosphorus is kind of the sweet spot. But if you look at some of these recommended use rates and you work out the math to ppms of elemental phosphorus, not the P that's on the label because that's P2O5. You got to do like one step conversion, but it's still a little bit too much. It ends up being 100 to 150 ppms of phos. So yeah, I think it's still a problem. I think PK boosters are still over applied. And in reality, what we've learned from our experiences is that the plants don't really need a PK boost in the mid to late stages of flowering. If anything, they need that phosphorus during the first 3 weeks during that stretch phase, because as they increase their surface area and they dilute the proteins, across the plant itself, as it stretches physically and grows rapidly over the course, sometimes it doubles in size. You may spend 4 or 5 weeks in veg, and the next thing you know, for the first 2 to 3 weeks of bloom, and half the time they grow twice as tall. It's the craziest thing. So that's really where you want to get phosphorus loaded into the plants. And then once they stop stretching, the plants are really asking for a calcium push. And that calcium push is something that we've seen consistently over and over again at a number of different facilities. When you cut the PK boosters out in the mid to late stages of bloom and you start adding the calcium in, you get way better results. You get increased density because calcium is literally a piece of the cell wall, whereas phosphorus is not. Phosphorus is just recycled in terms of its electrochemical properties. You can shove way more calcium into the plant than you can phosphorus, like significantly more. In some cases, we've seen actually that we've been able to load more calcium than even nitrogen into the plants, and that directly translates to yield. And it also translates to quality
Wow.
because if calcium is a constituent of the cell wall, it makes sense then that your flower will have a longer shelf life after you've dried and cured it because it has better resistance to oxidation and degradation and even, breaking down in the presence of light. If it's your flower sitting, if you're a commercial producer and you bag it up and it's sitting on the shelf at a recreational store where the sun or the
Right.
light shining on it, a lot of times there's really bright, cute displays to kind of attract the consumer's attention and eyes and, oh, look at what's inside the shiny bag. So that light coming in can actually destroy terpenes and degrade cannabinoids. It can certainly very, very quickly break hash down too. I mean, if you ask any grower what's the importance of calcium, anyone that's been around the block a couple of times is going to tell you something like, oh, it makes the cell walls really thick. It makes the plants really strong. It gives them good structure, makes them buff and burly and all that stuff, which is true. However, calcium is not necessarily, I always make this joke that calcium is mobile, and the mobility of calcium or the way that it moves in waves across plants is perhaps a separate point of discussion. But calcium is basically sunk into the plants. As they continue to take it up, they continue to sink it into cell walls. They kind of like shove it in these nooks and crannies. And the more calcium you get, the better the effect is overall. But a lot of growers that know intuitively that calcium provides for the strength and rigidity of the plant are also the ones to kind of cut calcium out a little bit before the flowers are actually done bulking up and they're done hardening. It's a big
Mm.
problem because you separate the flowers from the rest of the biomass at harvest. You don't want the rest of the biomass to contain all of the calcium, whose benefits are all of the things that we know to be true. Better rigidity, better cellular structure, better resistance to mold and disease pressures, things like that. That's everything that we want to describe the flowers. And so you don't want to cut the calcium out. In fact, if you weighed the biomass, the actual harvest of the flowers versus the stalks and the stems and the leaves, undoubtedly the flowers weigh a lot more. So really we need to sink a lot more calcium into those flowers, because if we can get the flowers to have better cellular structure, to have better rigidity as they grow, to have better resistance to disease pressures and things like that, the whole plant operates a lot better. So now where's this bridge? How do we connect the two? What's going on with the trichome heads and the stalks versus this calcium metabolism thing? Well, when calcium is metabolized in plants, there are certain types of organic acid residues that it's complexed with, like pectic acid. I think everybody knows about pectic acid. It creates a gelatinous type of effect. So if you ever have like jams or preserves or jellies or something like that, chances are they have some pectin, and that's going to be listed as an ingredient. Pectin makes up the cell walls, and it's like a little glued gelatinous layer. And when plants take up calcium, they basically match the calcium, which is a positive charge, with pectic acid residues that are negatively charged, and they shove them in the cell wall. So they end up creating these like cross-linked polymers that do a really good job of holding the cell wall together for the plants. On a slightly different level too, when you're talking about an ample supply of calcium going into the plants, that reinforcement of the cell wall provides a metabolic advantage because now plants don't have to sink as much carbon into that equation. They have the calcium that's present, and the calcium provides a really, really strong structural basis. So it's like they have more of that element, and they can take more of the carbon that otherwise would have been diverted towards the cell wall to reinforce it. They can take that carbon, which is surplus now, and they can funnel it towards trichome development, terpene development. There are pectic acid residues that do make up the walls of the trichome stalks. I don't know if they're complex with calcium. I haven't seen anything that seems to suggest that, but even pectic acid residues themselves, as we all know from jams and jellies, they can kind of hold their own shape, so to speak. So
Wow. That is
when you
crazy.
divert more carbon and more organic acids towards the trichomes and the trichome heads, that's where you get better productivity. And that is a direct benefit associated with having the proper loads of calcium inside of the plants. Now, there's a difference between putting calcium in your plants and continuing to feed calcium nitrate into your plants.
Right. Most CalMags having that nitrogen content, which is why it's such a detrimental piece of advice to just be like, oh, more CalMag, especially in flower. Somebody sent me a picture recently. This CalMag product had 4% nitrogen, which I thought 2% was the higher end on some of these products. But that's a lot of nitrogen to be adding in on top of what you're already feeding your plant.
Yeah, and the problem with nitrates fundamentally is that, it's like dollar bills in a bank account for a plant. If the plant has a dollar, just like if you have a dollar, you go to the store, you can only buy something that's valued at a dollar. You can't just cut that dollar bill in half and pretend like it's $2. The cashier is going to look at you like you're nuts. Plants also are faced with this. They gain energy by going through this photosynthetic process. That light energy that comes in and the energy gained from splitting water molecules apart, this energy gets funneled either towards nitrate reduction or towards carbon reduction, because nitrates are NO3 and carbon in the air is CO2. They both got the same problem. They both have oxygen, NO3 and CO2. The O3 and the O2 are not really relevant to the plants. They actually need to spend their money to break those bonds apart and to say, I want the nitrogen, but not the oxygen, or I want the carbon, but not the oxygen. So when you continue to feed nitrates into your plants, really what you're doing is diverting power away from grabbing carbon out of the air and making things like pectic acid residues. Those pectic acid residues will complex with calcium to make thicker cell walls, but the plant cannot afford that at the grocery store. The plant instead has to buy the nitrate. That's why nitrates, if you look at the literature, you'll find a lot of, and it's kind of a little bit subjective. I'm not saying this is 100% true at all the time, but generally speaking, the tendency is that nitrates actually create thinner cell walls because the energy got diverted away from making pectic acids and deposited into nitrate reduction, which is kind of a fundamental problem because you want your flowers to have really thick cell walls. This is why a lot of growers during the first couple of weeks of bloom will actually feed ammoniacal forms of nitrogen rather than nitrate forms of nitrogen. It keeps the flowers a little bit more dense and compact, and it keeps the cell walls just a little bit thicker because the ammoniacal forms have already been reduced down to a certain point where they can then be further processed. Obviously, there's an upper limit to the benefits associated with ammoniacal nitrogen. Cannabis plants love nitrates. They're actually sort of predisposed to taking up nitrates with the way that their rubisco mechanism works. Like most other C3 plants, they're kind of optimized to run on nitrates. That's like the rocket fuel or the race fuel, so to speak. But they can take up ammoniacal forms of nitrogen that do provide benefits, particularly for growers that don't want to see a stretch effect happen with their plants. So yeah, the whole point here is the nitrates will take the spending power or the purchasing power away from making, or I should say buying terpenes and buying cannabinoids and buying thick trichome structures and thick cell walls. And it's going to go towards making proteins like chlorophyll and things that ultimately, I don't know a single grower who analyzes their flower or their leaves for chlorophyll concentration and then goes out to potential buyers of those test results and says, look how much chlorophyll I have. Wow, you want to buy my product? It's super high in chlorophyll. No one does that. Everyone wants the terpenes and the trichomes and the cannabinoids, and nitrates at a certain point get in the way.
I could not agree more. I think like I said, I think we've all experienced that before, which is the late flower nitrogen dose fucking up how it comes out. And really what you want is, like you said, that senescence to come into play. And I want to go back to what you said a moment ago. You were mentioning chlorophyll earlier in the episode and how it's kind of broken down into these other compounds. Now, when I'm looking at a leaf and late in flower and it starts to change colors, and I don't mean that it's starting to yellow or have necrosis or anything like that. It's just going from green to like a deep purple or a crimson. Maybe the leaf isn't even curling, but it's changing colors. Is that a degradation or transformation or replacement of chlorophyll with something like the flavonoid anthocyanin, which is what I understand is responsible for colors like that? What's happening there, and how does it relate to that chlorophyll equation?
Well, so that's interesting because most of the anthocyanins and the carotenoids and things like that, those sort of accessory pigments, if you will, that are different colors, they're actually there at the same time that chlorophyll is. It's just that the way that chlorophyll itself is oriented on the top of the leaf surface almost like blocks out that color entirely. And the way that it's sort of complexed in with plants naturally, I mean, carotenoids are present kind of right alongside chlorophyll.
No
because
way. I didn't
part
know
of the
that.
job.
It's a blank. The chlorophyll is a blanket over the other colorful compounds?
Kind of. It's the way that the pigments are set up towards the top of the leaf surface, because that's where most of that light energy is going to be captured. It's kind of like the spot at which, because when the gases enter the leaf surface, that's where you want all of that light energy, because that's where your rubisco is going to be. Obviously, the deeper that you get into the cell, the less light penetration there is, the less kind of rubisco activity and the less chlorophyll there is. I mean, most of the chlorophyll is going to be concentrated in the topmost layers. So yeah, the reason that the plants are overtly green and you can't quite tell the purples and the yellows is because those compounds may be there. They're just kind of cloaked by the density of the chlorophyll and just how that top layer is the one that refracts and reflects most of that green light back towards your eyes, and some of it comes through, and all that good stuff. But
Yeah.
the carotenoids themselves, like certain carotenoids are actually right alongside chlorophyll, because if chlorophyll gets overexcited and there's too much light energy that comes in, it can literally blow up. And the carotenoids are like these shock absorbers, so to speak. Very, very fascinating stuff. It's actually very difficult to get this perspective or this understanding sometimes because we're humans and we have this like macroscopic perspective. But if you looked at the leaf surface, let's say you were really, really small and you were just the size of chlorophyll pigment, that is a very, very extreme and hostile environment, the leaf surface. There is constant light energy coming in and it's bombarding the plants, and chlorophylls always are blowing up. Carotenoids are always blowing up. Millions of times per second, chlorophyll takes in too much light energy and it explodes.
Wow.
And the chlorophylls, once they kind of explode, there are these enzymes that come in, they pull it back down and out, and they try to rebuild it or repurpose the structure. They kind of like, it's like almost like a scrapyard, so to speak. There's the enzymes that kind of go through and try to salvage what they can and then rebuild a new chlorophyll molecule and then kind of reinsert it back there. So it's a very hostile environment. There's always stuff being turned over, is the proper sort of enzymatic term. There's enzyme and protein turnover very, very rapidly, happens all the time. The leaf surface itself is not a cool, calm, collected place. It is not just like a walk in the park or a nice walk down the sandy beach. It's very, very violent. Things are always changing. So in terms of senescence, there's always this signaling element that's present in the plants. They kind of have this sense of balance figured out, between oxidation and reduction and too much light energy and not enough light energy. They're doing all of these micro adjustments to really quickly change, to adapt to the changing environment. And oftentimes the environment may just be too tough for them. So this is where you can start to do things like premature senescence. If there's not enough nitrogen coupled with the light intensity being too high and the amount of available water being too low, man, you can make a plant go yellow and brittle real fast. It just overrides, the senescence kind of kicks in and says, time to pack up shop. We're leaving here. And in some cases, when the leaf tissue is damaged or burned beyond repair, the plants will not repair it. That's why, plants do a terrible job at repairing burned, brown, spotted leaves.
Right.
And they do a really good job of growing new leaves. They kind of suck at repairing stuff once it's been broken down to that point. They'd rather just grow something new, grow new leaf tissue.
We'll be right back to the program, but before that, let me tell you about the Order of Cultivation, our secret society, our membership for cannabis cultivators. If you love GrowCast, you are going to love the Order. First of all, we have hundreds of hours of member content that's exclusive video content, as well as archived GrowCast episodes. Every single week, I go live from the Biodome and we do GrowCast TV. It's our best content out there. It's interactive, it's live, it's for members only at growcastpodcast.com/membership. You'll never have a garden problem again that we won't get solved for you. We have a member Discord where we take care of our members and their gardens every single day. We have contests and grow-alongs that have weekly prizes. There's so much going on in the Order of Cultivation, I really can't explain it. There's member discounts. These are the biggest discounts that you'll find for these brands anywhere, and they're only for members at the Order of Cultivation. We've also got big discounts on Rhizo Rich's genetics for GrowCast Seed Co., and members get all the first dibs and the first drops for all of our seeds and clones. You got to check out what we're doing because we're closing our doors in January, and you don't want to miss out. growcastpodcast.com/membership. Get in on all the action, hundreds of hours of bonus content, tune into the live streams. If you need plant support, we got you. Or join in a grow along, win some prizes just for growing in your garden. Check it out at growcastpodcast.com/membership. It's a great way to support this show. And like I said, if you like GrowCast, you're going to love the Order. Get on in before January, everybody. I hope to see you in there. All right, let's get back to it with more GrowCast. Back to the senescence and the anthocyanin production. This is when a lot of flavonoids are produced, or like you said, are they kind of there already?
Anthocyanins are technically a type of flavonoids. Flavonoids themselves are a very, very diverse and large group of compounds. There's, depending on what you read in the literature, some people say 4,000, or I should say over 4,000. I've seen other data that suggests over 8,000, let's just say somewhere around 10,000 different flavonoids have been identified so far. And a lot of them, because flavonoids share the same kind of general backbone. They're all kind of like the same blueprint base material. There's one thing that defines all flavonoids, and then there's a lot of stuff that differentiates those flavonoids. Not all flavonoids are going to be visible as pigments, but anthocyanins certainly are. And there's a particular thing that can happen to help promote the biosynthesis of anthocyanins, like you and I had talked about earlier. Maybe dropping temperatures is one way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
It could also be in response to a nutrient deficiency, but the general function of flavonoids and even anthocyanins is very, very broad. And there's a lot of different ways that they behave, particularly when we're looking at the differences between how flavonoids interact with the human body and the human nervous system versus how flavonoids might interact with an insect or a mold or a mildew or something like that.
Oh, yeah. I'd read some research paper that may have said that that was a big part of our evolution, is eating these bitter plants and consuming these plants that are making compounds that are really there to drive away predators and things like that. So why don't we start from the top? You said that there are things that make flavonoids similar. Let's talk about that. What are those things, or that thing?
So flavonoids you can look at as, generally speaking, their base form is a 15 carbon compound. So in that sense, they're related to sesquiterpenes, which everybody knows and loves. The monoterpenes have 10, sesquiterpenes have 15. Flavonoids also have 15 kind of at their base. And they've got these three little rings. We'll call them A, B, and C ring. Two of them are 6 carbon. One of them is 3 carbon. That's kind of like the core structure, very, very basic, fundamental. Most of the differences in all of the flavonoids that have been characterized to date so far have been in one of the rings. Let's call it the C ring. The types of functional groups that are substituted, or the degree of oxidation or the degree of reduction, starts to affect the way that that ring is bonded with the other 2 rings. And so you have this blueprint, so to speak, for a very, very diverse set of different molecules. In this case, we're talking about potentially more than 8,000 to 10,000 molecules. And like I said, most of them are going to be differentiated based on the differences to be found in one of those rings, in one of those ring structures. Some of them are visible pigments, others are not. Some of the flavonoids are produced in roots, for example, and others are not. If we're talking about like ginger plants and turmeric plants, even licorice roots, for example, those have very well characterized flavonoids that may not actually be present in the leaf surface. So you have this core building block that works its way up to the leaves, let's say, or it not works its way up to the leaves because technically the carbon comes in through the leaves. But the way that a leaf surface might utilize a flavonoid structure to build an anthocyanin may actually be different than what the roots are using those same building blocks for. Because if you pull a plant out of the ground, unless it's a purple carrot, let's say you're growing cannabis, I've never seen purple roots in a cannabis plant.
That would be pretty cool.
Yeah, not to say that it's not, technically speaking, it's likely possible, but whether that expression happens naturally to the plants or not is a different story entirely. So
Right.
It's possible because cannabis plants produce flavonoids in the roots, right? But the pathway that they take to utilize those basic building blocks is going to be different than something like a purple carrot, which may also take the exact same building block, that basic flavonoid structure, and decide, you know what, I'm going to make anthocyanins down in the root. Whereas cannabis plants may say, you're crazy, we need to make it up in the leaf surface because that's where all that UV light energy is coming in. So if we make a purple pigment that can absorb that UV light energy, it's one defense strategy against dealing with light intensity. This is why, growers that put UV lights on their plants sometimes do notice that those purple pigments can come out. It is very taxing on the plants. It's very energy intensive. So you better have high CO2 concentrations if you want to squeeze, as many pigments out. Or you need to have a high carbon load, I should say, is a more appropriate way of saying it. You have to have a high carbon load coming into the plants to really make the most out of that pathway. Real quick, before I finish up this quick point, I want to mention that the flavonoid pathway, that phenylpropanoid pathway, accounts for about 20% of the overall carbon flux through the plant. And it also serves as a building block for lignin, which is like a super strong version of cellulose. So it's like when the plant needs to get really thick and burly like a tree, that's when lignin is biosynthesized. Lignin is a tight phenolic compound with great structural stability. It takes an extremely long time to break down. And lignin actually is the preferred substrate for the manufacturing of biochar, specifically because it requires such intense heat and pressure in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, pressure can help break it down pretty well too. So it's important to understand that about 20% of the overall carbon that gets fluxed through the plants naturally, just out there in nature, may be related to the pathways that produce those purple pigments, which is why when you grow your purple plants, you may have noticed that the deeper the purple or the more intense that purple coloration oftentimes is correlated with lower cannabinoid expressions and perhaps lower terpene expressions, because the carbon substrate is competitive at that point. It's either making the purple pigment or it's making the terpenes and cannabinoids, just like it's either taking the light energy to reduce the nitrates or it's taking the light energy to reduce the carbon and to then make flavonoids and terpenes and cannabinoids, things like that.
Right, right.
I want to kind of stress the point that the whole plant is medicinal here. And a lot of growers may focus, and rightly so, because the terpenes and cannabinoids are therapeutic compounds. They may focus on the flowers, but in that pursuit of the perfect run on the flowers and getting those trichome heads just right and all that stuff, they may kind of lose sight of the fact that the leaves themselves, which produce flavonoids, may also have beneficial qualities due to those flavonoids and the concentration of those flavonoids. I personally think flower is a more complex high than concentrates, and even a good quality hash rosin, for example, to me is always missing something. And that something I think comes down to flavonoid chemistry and the way that flavonoids naturally interact with terpenes and with cannabinoids. I mean, cannabinoids themselves are built on a derivative of the phenylpropanoid pathway, which was tightly correlated with flavonoids. So the two share a similar parent. They have the same parent pathway, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be some synergistic chemistry between them, the flavonoids and the cannabinoids, but also because olivetolic acid is a derivative of the phenylpropanoid pathway, you have this building block that is fundamentally the same coming in, and then that building block gets added onto, and that's what makes olivetolic acid, which then becomes a constituent of cannabinoids. From my perspective, the flavonoids, the terpenes, the cannabinoids, those are all inseparable. That's the real entourage effect. It's not just the terpenes. It's not just the cannabinoids. You have to factor in flavonoids to create that holy trinity. And that's where you get a very, very well-rounded experience. This is one of the reasons that I like tea as much as I do, because tea is the master of flavonoid chemistry. Cannabis plants are masters of terpenophenolic chemistry because that's what's required to make cannabinoids. Tea is a master of flavonoid chemistry. And if you learn how to layer that, the flavonoids produced by tea into your nervous system, along with terpenes and cannabinoids, you realize flavonoids, like you mentioned earlier, they can actually accentuate the effects in the experience. They can be outright psychedelic in some cases. And it's kind of trippy, for lack of a better phrase, just how powerful this energy can be. And I don't think that you find that in anything else, to be honest.
I love it, man. All the tea heads out there, extra flavonoid injection. So this idea that it affects us in a very unique way. There's lots of studies that these compounds are antioxidant, they're antibacterial, they're anti-cancer, like you said. They've got a wide range of health benefits in people. A lot of the benefits that we get from the vegetables that we're told to eat so much come from compounds like these. But you said it's different for their other intended purposes. My understanding is that flavonoids are generally, or you can tell me ubiquitously, bitter compounds. And like you said, when an insect bites into that, they don't want that compound, right?
Yeah. I think a lot of people associate flavonoids with flavor because it's in there. But really, it's just a reference to a whole bunch of very, very complex structures that are kind of subdivided, like we talked about, that C ring, depending on how reduced or oxidized it is and how that carbon is ranged. You get flavones, flavonones, flavonols, flavonols, catechins, anthocyanins. You get some chalcones, which are really, really important structures too. So there's like literally 10,000 different compounds.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are anti-nutritional. So when a insect crawls around and bites the leaf surface, oftentimes the plant, because it's in a state of producing sugars, it would rather not sacrifice the production of sugar. It would rather take about 20% of those sugars, let's say, and funnel it towards a pathway that produces a compound that is anti-nutritional, meaning the insect is going to bite it and it's going to get the sap, but the sap has been modified. The well water has been poisoned, so to speak. Someone shit in the water. And what ends up happening is the insect takes in that sap and that sugar, but the anthocyanins may prevent the absorption of that sugar or make it very, very difficult for the insects to digest anyways. So it can irritate their stomach lining. In some cases, the flavonoids can interact with the nervous system of insects. It can kind of make them racy and jittery. Caffeine, I think, is a good example of an alkaloid that has kind of a similar effect on insects. They're neurotoxic. And so a lot of highly caffeinated plants, insects don't mess with that. Insects don't need a 100 milligram shot of caffeine to start their day, their nervous systems blow up, their hearts explode. Plants do this stuff on purpose. They basically say to the insect, go ahead, I can't move, but you can. Go ahead and bite into me. You're going to get a lot more than you ask for, that
Right.
type of thing.
Yeah,
And in
exactly.
certain cases, it can be anti-nutritional. It can also be so that anti-nutritional thing for insects may also be an anti-inflammatory thing for humans. The way that the human body and the human nervous system utilizes flavonoids is quite different overall. And for us, they're very, very healthy. Their ability to chelate metals in particular with a high affinity makes them excellent detoxifying compounds. And their remarkable anti-inflammatory benefits actually make them really, really good for things like preventing chronic heart disease, neurodegeneration, like early stage Alzheimer's, for example. It's been shown that flavonoids can contribute to an increased brain function overall in conjunction with things like ketones, which are preferred fuel sources for cells in the brain. They also, because they have these scavenging properties, they have the ability to scavenge for heavy metals and free radicals like superoxides and hydrogen peroxides and all that stuff.
Right.
They're really good sort of like vacuum cleaners. They go along from each neuron to your brain, and as they kind of flow around in your bloodstream, what they do is they kind of pick up all of this like plaque that starts to build up on the outside of your brain cells, outside of the neurons. And eventually, after a while of this plaque building up, you can start to have issues with the way that neurons fire. And that's where you start to get some neurodegenerative effects, like maybe loss of memory, or, even worse, you kind of lose motor function and you can no longer remember for more than a couple of seconds. That could just be an issue of plaque that's being built up. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, and oftentimes it is a lot more complex than that. But if you're just looking specifically at one small mechanism of action, flavonoids are a great candidate to keep your brain healthy, to keep your heart healthy, to keep your liver fully detoxified and healthy. It's almost like having a little mini liver, so to speak, inside of every single cell in your body, whose job it is to soak up all of the stuff that's bad for you that's coming in from the environment. And it's a really good way to kind of purge and detox. But they can be
100%.
bitter, and in some cases they can be a little bit difficult to digest. Like, for example, the flavonoids that are found in coffee. Coffee can be very, very intense because of the way that the flavonoids are roasted and the way that the flavonoids are arranged in their particular molecular formats. This can be very difficult for people to digest on an empty stomach. Imagine waking up in the morning and drinking 16 ounces of coffee. Most people would probably prefer to eat something with that coffee. Otherwise, it could upset their stomach.
Right.
Part of it, obviously, is the caffeine. Part of it's the flavonoids. But yeah, those, generally speaking, those bitter-like compounds, the flavonoids, are very, very useful medicines and also very, very useful deterrents against insects and things that we don't want on the plants. And we probably don't want parasites and things like that in the human body either.
That's right. And coffee is a good example of both of those things, actually, because it produces a lot of caffeine. Like you said, to keep those insects away. There's only a few insects that really tolerate that or are immune to that. I don't know why the coffee borer beetle. I guess maybe because it's not feasting on the fruit. Anyways, I'm not sure. I would have to look into that. But yeah, it produces that caffeine for pest repellent properties. And then, like you were saying, the antioxidant quality of these compounds, that really seems to be a huge part of what, when I did the Coffee Health and Science podcast, it was all about the health effects and health studies. Coffee is the most studied food product on the planet when it comes to health. And there's so much disease prevention from, like you said, reducing the plaques and tangles in your brain and reducing Alzheimer's and dementia risk, all the way to liver health, heart health, you name it. And really, when I spoke to someone like Dr. Sanjeev Chopra, who is a doctor, he was talking about the antioxidants. The chlorogenic acid is the most common one and what it does to your body. So I think we tend to neglect that. We need to get these plant compounds into our bloodstream, into our body, not just smoking, but also consuming them, drinking teas, eating fresh vegetables, and getting it on our brain with a nice, healthy, purple cannabis delivery every once in a while. So I think that it's important to go holistic on this one and never, never count out the health impacts of these antioxidants and flavonoids and plant compounds. So
Yeah.
I love it, man.
Yeah. And the ones that are produced in the leaves are really, really interesting too. One of the things I'll mention too is that a lot of times when we're looking, we have to keep like a sort of a sense of balance in mind. And when we're looking at flavonoids that concentrate in leaf tissue in particular, really we find, due to the function, the actual structural functional properties of these flavonoids, we oftentimes find them paired or associated with beneficial minerals, or in some cases detrimental metals, like the heavy metals that flavonoids are known to scavenge for and detoxify, and some of the free radicals that are out there just kind of naturally as a result of natural normal metabolic cycles. Flavonoids can participate greatly in maintaining that sort of state of charge balance. And the thing that I think separates something like tea from something like coffee could be, where those flavonoids are most concentrated. For tea, it's obviously in the leaves. And that brings with it a sort of a mineral balance, so to speak. So the concentration of flavonoids in certain leaves may actually be higher, along with a concentration of minerals. And what that translates to in the brew is that you get a calcium-rich brew that has a very soft mouthfeel, but a very powerful sort of flavonoid effect, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of brings us back to, late stage senescence. Potassium is a very, very important element because plants use it to create that charge balance. They'll take organic acids that are produced naturally through rubisco as it continues to suck CO2 in. And as that light energy comes in and helps the plants produce sugars and organic acids and things of that nature. Organic acids are a fundamental building block for all cannabinoids. I mean, what do growers do at the end of the curing stage? The whole point of curing is to decarboxylate the flower, which means you remove organic acids from the equation. The whole point here that we're talking about is how those organic acids got into the equation in the first place. And that's through this rubisco sort of umbrella at large. And plants will use potassium to create a charge balance against the organic acids that are being created. So the more carbon that you want to load your plants up with, the more you have to be aware that they are always trying to maintain a state of charge balance in every single cell. And that fundamentally comes down to potassium. So a lot of flushing formulas or a lot of finishing formulas may include potassium and just potassium, like we do with our resin bloom. The reason potassium is safe to apply through the flush period is because it does not become a constituent of organic matter. Nitrogen does, calcium does. Phosphorus is more used for its electrochemical purposes. Magnesium does, is kind of like nitrogen, calcium. So you want to avoid putting those cations into the plant. Obviously, phosphates are not cationic, but point being ultimately that potassium, when you feed that potassium into the plants, especially during that last week, really what you're doing is elevating the water metabolism of that plant. You're helping promote the opening and the closing of the stomata, the flow of water up and down the whole plant. And as that water flows up and down and in and out of the plant, associated with that or fundamentally tied to it is the removal of CO2 from the air and the production of sugars to make more terpenes and to make more cannabinoids. So if you slow that water uptake down, you get a decrease in terpenes and a decrease in cannabinoids. Obviously, at some point in the flowering stage, the plants naturally decrease and they slow down their rate of transpiration, but you want to try to keep that as elevated as you can. And the best way to do that is to keep the potassium load high in the plants while you continue to cut things out like nitrogen and then cut the phosphorus out, but keep the potassium levels high. And a lot of growers are also starting to find that keeping calcium levels high, although not as high as potassium, but keeping them, moderately high during the finishing stages, the last 1 to 2 weeks of the plant's life, they are getting beneficial results from it while they're cutting out the magnesium and doing all this other stuff. Maintaining that proper potassium nutrition status in plants is definitely critical for making sure that you have a good, strong finish. Elevated levels of potassium are generally tied to the hardness of a plant, the kind of the frost factor and the glossiness, that kind of look and feel that it has. A certain bag appeal can be found from utilizing potassium. As long as you dry the flowers out properly, the potassium does not accumulate and store within the plants. So you can load up a bunch and then go through the drying process and then the curing process, and you will have no residues that are sort of excessive, so to speak.
We should just briefly, before we wrap up the show, talk about the kind of actual harvest process and just quickly on dry and cure, because it sounds like you've got, again, a wealth of information to share here. One thing I'd like to talk to you about specifically in your cannabis grow, when you're scoping trichomes late in flower, what would you look for? A lot of growers, they wait for 50-50 cloudy and clear for an early harvest, or they wait for amber to come along a little bit for, like, I would say kind of an average grower harvest, or they wait for a lot of amber and take it late. How much do you take scoping into trichomes into account when you're timing your harvest?
That's a great question. I actually think in a lot of ways, the whole process kind of starts when you make that decision of when to harvest the plants. Because if you want to make a really strong hash, for example, there's two things you can do. One is you can pick it super early while everything is still milky and white, closer to day 45, let's say, or something like that, right around week 7, day 49. A lot of growers will do this because what it does is it creates a product that's really milky, really white, sells really well because it looks great. It's really, really ghostly, has a nice touch of creaminess to it, partially due to, presumably partially due to some flavonoids that are present there, because they do have this kind of goldish color naturally. But then on the flip side, if you want a really powerful, like super stony kind of hash, you can look towards picking the flowers a little bit later, because as those terpenes and cannabinoids continue to mature within the actual trichome head while the plant's still alive, you start to get a broader spectrum of cannabinoids that are produced. And some of these broader spectrum cannabinoids can actually create more of a stony kind of effect. It does change the color quite a bit, because the more oxidized, some of these compounds become, the darker their color overall is, but also the stronger the effect. So whether you're pressing out hash rosin or you're making, dry sift, traditional way, Lebanese or Afghani style, it's all about just knowing what kind of product you want. I would say if you're just growing for bag appeal in a flower, you do want just a hint of gold. So, you probably want to look somewhere around 50-50, if not just a maybe 60% milky white and then 40% amber. Part of it comes down to the strain too. A lot of strains will produce these back end cannabinoids that are just really desirable because they contribute to such a unique layer of the experience. Like a good, Jack the Cleaner strain, I think it's the Jack the Ripper, the one that has all of the THCV inside of it. If you take that one a little bit longer, that one is definitely a lot more complex of a body high type of experience. But on the flip side, if you've got some super silver haze or a mango haze, something like that, if you pick it early on, it could create like a super potent psychedelic effect, which oftentimes the haze strains do. There's not a big demand in the market for it because they can be so powerful and so overwhelming. But if that's your jam, then that's definitely the way to do it. Take a haze strain and pick it just a pinch early and process it into a good hash or a good rosin, press it out into a good rosin. If you can, haze strains typically have really low return rates, but even if you blast it with hydrocarbons and get a BHO extract or whatever, those end up being remarkably powerful.
I like your whole thought process here, man. I couldn't agree more. And you're right; those hashers harvesting it early for that bag appeal, but don't always be fooled by the looks. Some of those darker hashes are just wonderful. But you're right; that is definitely a strategy that a lot of people use and enjoy. And then taking that flower a little bit longer. I also like what you said about, it seems to me, cultivar dependent, how much the experience changes when you do take it longer. Like you said, it must be some sort of genetic capability for them to produce these ancillary cannabinoids late. But some strains, you do a partial harvest early and late, and you don't see much of a difference. And then other ones, you time it differently, and it makes the world of difference. So just another infinite complexity to this amazing plant.
Yeah, and part of it too is the plants are really quick to make some structures that could take a very, very long time to break down. So myrcene is a good one to look at, because myrcene is a monoterpene that, when done properly, myrcene can convert into something that they call hashinine. There was a group of French researchers in 2014, I believe it was, and they basically took some Moroccan flower and Moroccan hash. The hash was made from the flower, and basically what they were doing was measuring both of them and then overlaying the maps and saying, well, what are some of the differences between them, and can we trace how the flower, which was turned into the hash, how the speciation of these compounds occurred and how it was created. So what they ended up finding was that myrcene itself, when exposed to the right level of light and the right level of oxygen, there's this reconfiguration that happens. Myrcene has a double carbon bond that will take in that light energy and reconfigure itself in three-dimensional space. It doesn't blow up and it doesn't break apart. It doesn't quote unquote off gas. It just changes its shape and structure in such a way that actually increases the potency by, I think they said like 11x or 17x or something like that. But this goes to explain how and why hash can be a lot more powerful of an effect overall versus just flower. Not that there's, even if we account for the differences in the biomass in terms of like the leaf material that you're going to have on the flower, which you are not going to have in the hash. I'm talking about just the profile of the constituents, the way that the hash is made ends up amplifying the parent molecules, so to speak. So when the flower is produced and when you harvest, that's really just the beginning of the transformative effects. In fact, you can't even enjoy the flower properly, I think, in some cases. THCA and non-decarboxylated cannabinoids certainly have been shown to have medical applications, but you can't just like take, bud fresh off a plant, put it into a pipe, smoke it, and expect a good experience. You're going to be kind of in for a world of hurt, and your lungs aren't going to thank you for it as a result of that. So it's almost like you need to go through this process of transformation anyway. So you might as well do it right. Do justice to the molecules that are present inside of the trichome heads, because if you pay attention to how you dry the flower and how you cure it, you could end up with flower 90 days later that is significantly stronger than anything that preceded that 90 days. If you smoke it at day 60, it's not going to be quite as strong. In a lot of ways, there's a parallel to tea with that, because tea, if you age it properly, it actually gets stronger. It's the trippiest thing. Cannabis is like that too. Good cannabis flowers that are grown properly with the right calcium load, with the right potassium to help it flush and finish, with the right flavonoid concentration, with all of these things lined up, done properly, good flower can cure for at least 90 days before it's finally ready to smoke. Just like good hash can take 6 months to make and then another year to cure and store before it's finally ready to smoke. And it will fuck you up. It will change everything that you thought you knew about hash if you smoke some good, traditionally aged hash.
I could not agree more, man. And I think, rosin is wonderful. We're in the age of rosin, but can't sleep on that hash. Cannot sleep on that hash. And don't sleep on that tea either. Speaking of which, don't sleep on Rooted Leaf. Of course, check out Rooted Leaf, everybody. Rootedleaf.com is where you can find it, right?
Yep.
Code GROWCAST for 20% off your Rooted Leaf nutrients. Thank you for making that code, man. I'm certainly enjoying your products. We appreciate you coming on and educating us as always. And we have so much more to talk about. We'll get you on again soon. Anything else here before we sign off? Any parting thoughts?
I think we kind of covered everything we wanted to cover. We looked at anthocyanins, flavonoids. I would just challenge people to kind of look at their plants in a totally different light. When you're in that garden looking at those flowers develop, just think to yourself, what if there's something inside of the stalk that hasn't yet been found, that is super potent, medicinal, therapeutic, can help solve a real, medical challenge? And the answer is probably, yeah, the whole cannabis plant is still mysterious. So don't ever lose sight of that. The whole plant is medicinal, and we've just begun to explore what's inside of the flowers, how we can change it through transformation, like hash rosin, for example, all this wild stuff. We are just on the tip of the iceberg. So continue to be inspired in your gardens, continue to learn from these plants because they have a lot more to teach.
I love it, man. Couldn't have said it better myself. Nick, everybody, I know you loved this show. Go and check out rootedleaf.com. And if you do, make sure to use code GROWCAST, 20% off. Thank you, dear listener, for tuning in today. I hope you're doing awesome things in your garden. Stay tuned to this show, of course. You can find Rooted Leaf on Instagram at The Rooted Leaf, and you can find GrowCast on Instagram at GrowCast. But go to growcastpodcast.com/action to see all the stuff. Get on the list. It's free. We're doing giveaways. And just stay tuned, everybody. We got a lot of great stuff coming at you, so don't touch that dial. That's all for now, though. This is Nick and Jordan River signing off, saying have an awesome day out there, everybody. Be safe and grow smarter. That's our show for today. Thank you to Nick from Rooted Leaf. Before we wrap it up, shout out to SD Microbes, sdmicrobeworks.com, code GROWCAST for 10% off the best compost that money can buy, BioVast. This stuff blew me away, folks. I am now using it in my garden. I'm so excited to be using this stuff. We scoped it during the Living Soil Masterclass tour. And like I said, BioVast is the best compost that money can buy, in my opinion. I have not seen anything more impressive out there. Plus, SD Microworks has bokashi and a bunch of other goodies. You got to check it out. sdmicrobeworks.com, code GROWCAST for 10% off site-wide. And again, if you're not sure that your biology is thriving in your rhizosphere, then you go ahead and add some BioVast compost, and you can rest assured that there is a wide diversity of microbes now going to work on your plant's root system. And that's exactly what you want, is that biological diversity. Check it out now at sdmicrobeworks.com. Use code GROWCAST. Try out some BioVast. Use it as a compost tea or inoculate your beds or your pots with it. You will not regret it, everyone. sdmicrobeworks.com, code GROWCAST. That's all, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that your garden is healthy and flourishing, and I'll see you on the next GrowCast. Stay tuned. Don't touch that dial. I appreciate you spending this time with me. Bye-bye, everyone.
Was using these PK boosters that'd be one or two plants that were always fried, and the growers like, I don't know what's going on.